Hello, students. Welcome back. We're continuing with the storytelling and introduction presentation. I'm Dr. Nicholas L. Stefanski for Alfred State College, and we're here with the third installment. And today we're talking about the setting of stories. The third essential component after plot and characters, we have setting. So, we all know that settings are important to stories and often kind of set the tone of the stories. The first way we can sort of think about classifying setting across different stories is how important the setting is to the story, how much impact the setting has on the story. Okay? And first is the possibility of a story with an irrelevant setting, in which the setting has little or no bearing on the characters or plot. And of course, this is pretty rare, but sometimes very simple stories, children's stories, the setting may have little or no bearing on the story. It may be sort of a fairy tale that's set in a castle or a fantasy world, or like a medieval castle, and then that somehow never really impacts the story too much. Even for simple stories or children's stories, it's rare, but across the board, it's even more rare. Second is if you have a functional setting. So this is where something material about the setting is very important or integral to the character development or the what happens with the plot, and actually material impacts what happens with either one of those, either the character or the plot. Right. So the simple example that I have here is so you have a setting for your story. It takes place on like somewhere with a volcano or a lava planet or something like that. And some actual material event happens. The character gets burned by the lava. And so that actually affects what happens in the plot. We'd call that a functional setting. Or a story set on Mars. Say in the near future, people are colonizing Mars and they have to sort of live underground or under a dome or something because of the atmosphere and the radiation, stuff like that. That would all be a functional setting. You can have symbolic setting, in which the setting has an impact on the story, but not so much through what materially happens with the character or plot, but rather it's supposed to influence something that the reader perceives about the setting. The setting has an additional symbolic message that doesn't necessarily happen in the story, but that we sort of attribute to it via the setting. Right? So say we had, again, we're back on the lava planet, and then we have sort of a conversation playing out between two people, and they don't get burned by the lava. They don't venture near the lava. It doesn't sort of materially affect them in any way, but we sort of attribute something to that scene that the lava is maybe like a metaphor for intense anger or something like that, right? So if it's that type of situation, then we'd call that a symbolic setting. Now, important note, it's possible to have a setting that's both functional and symbolic at the same time, right? And I chose the lava planet kind of deliberately, obviously, to talk about thinking about the Star Wars prequels, Revenge of the Sith, and the infamous high ground scene right between Anakin and Obi-Wan, right? So in that case, the setting on that lava planet in that moment is functional because Anakin gets burned by the lava and becomes Darth Vader. It's also symbolic. The lava kind of represents his kind of seething anger and turn to the dark side. So they could be separate. You could have either one, or it could be both. All right. So it's three ways that we can think about the impact of setting on stories. And of course, I guess I didn't talk too much about settings. I mean, settings can be all kinds of stuff. I gave the kind of simple example of a lava planet, but it could be something as specific as a particular house or home, a point in time, etc. We'll talk about a little bit more about that in a second. So there's three very basic ways in which we could sort of divide up types of setting. Obviously, as I just mentioned, the number of possible variances of setting is nearly infinite, right? Or probably it's actually infinite. But if we're sort of trying to study it to get a little initial purchase on it, we can divide it up into three. So first setting is this world, the world that we live in. And that generally corresponds to the style of writing of realism. So you watch like a drama show or movie that's sort of set in the present day, and everything is assumed to be just as we know how it is in the real world in the setting. That is a this world setting that corresponds to realism as a style. Second type of setting would be second world, which generally corresponds to the genre or style of writing of fantasy. So in a second world setting, it's sort of imagine that the story takes place in a world that's just sort of totally separate from our reality and everything that we know. So again, I've used the examples from George R. R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, right? In that setting, in that world, he's got a whole other world. I mean, kind of coincidentally, it looks things going on there look kind of a lot like um, medieval Europe and so on from the real world, but I mean that's another point. But it's a whole different world with its own history, its own culture, its own map, and even its own sort of um, planetary idiosyncrasies that give it sort of the weird case where winters are variable length, right? So it has some sort of bizarre astronomical stuff going on there, not to mention magic and so on. So if you're doing second world writing, which generally corresponds to fantasy, uh, the author is going to have extra work to do sort of with world building, because all of the things that someone would take for granted in realism that we can just sort of supply what we know about the real world are going to be absent in second world fantasy writing. Right? So there's world building of the second fantasy world is going to be a primary preoccupation of the writer or the filmmaker or what have you. Right? And the third type of setting that we can have is what I'm going to call this world plus novum. And when I say this world, I mean the realist world, the sort of present day Earth that we live in and know. And this is what often corresponds to the style of writing or genre of speculative fiction. And I say speculative fiction rather than science fiction because, as we'll talk about, there are a few different kind of subgenres of speculative fiction. So we'll call this world plus the novum. And a speculative fiction theorist named Darko Suvin kind of pioneered or coined this idea of the novum. Novum just means something new or like new point. It means like the new thing or the new point. And his suggestion is this is what makes speculative fiction unique from either fantasy on one hand or realism on the other hand, because the world of a speculative fiction work is assumed to be just like our world, just like the world that we know, but for the effects of one novum or possibly multiple nova, right? And so this is a little slightly different than fantasy, in which we sort of assume that the whole world is sort of totally different than what we know, and we're not necessarily supposed to import too much of our own understandings of the real world. In speculative fiction, according to Darko Suvin at least, we sort of assume everything about the real world that we know plus or minus the novum, right? And if you think about some different kinds of speculative fiction, you can think about what exactly is the novum, right? So for here in the graphics, I have Altered Carbon and The Expanse, which are two good shows on Netflix you should check out, especially The Expanse is one of my favorites. But so in both of them, the novum is the world, the historical world that we know, but sort of accelerated in future time to some certain amount of time, and they imagine that future differently. An altered carbon, I get the signature aspect of the novum is these stacks that human consciousness can be transplanted between different bodies or sleeves. And in the expanse, the primary feature of the novum is that humanity is kind of spread out and started to sort of occupy the whole solar system, and about the different political conflicts and stuff that happen because of that. All right. Now, you could also have a novum of an alternative history, what is also a subgenre of speculative fiction, right? So something that thinks that's the novum that says, like, okay, so I'm going to write in the setting of this world that we know and live in exactly how it is, except for this one event that happened X number of years ago. That one event is different, and now how would that have affected the world, right? So, like, obvious example of that is like The Man in the High Castle, that sort of speculates what would the world look like if the Axis powers had won World War II. Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick, and somebody made it into a TV show. Right? So all those are examples of speculative fiction, different kinds of nova that's introduced to make the setting something that is familiar but strange at the same time, which is what Darko Suvin calls cognitive estrangement. And he's being sort of a theorist of speculative fiction. He kind of thinks speculative fiction is better than the other kinds of writing, right? And I admit I'm a fan of speculative fiction, so I kind of agree with him. But the idea of cognitive estrangement is the novum produces the estrangement, but the estrangement remains cognitive, which means by sort of a rational thought operation, you can sort of make sense of why the novum is the way that it is. In contrast to fantasy, where if the author tells us there's dragons and magic and so on, then we're just supposed to say, oh, okay, we just accept it because that's sort of what's going on in the world. Okay, so got some activities and discussion for you for this one. So here on the discussion board, please, for the class, think about 2 stories that you know of. Could be from any media at this point. Try to choose one that you think makes a good use of setting. The setting is kind of nuanced or detailed or interesting to you in some way. And another one where you think the setting is kind of blah or generic or underdeveloped, right? So think of 2 different stories. And so for each of these, tell us, do the analysis for each one. Is it this world, second world, or novum? Is the setting functional, symbolic, or both? And then tell us a little bit why. Explain your positive or negative judgment about how the work that you're looking at uses the setting. What aspect of it do you think is causing that? And explain a little bit about it, both for the one that you think is good and interesting use of setting, and the one that setting leaves something to be desired. Okay? All right, so go ahead and do that. Work quickly on the discussion board. I mean, just really like a few sentences or paragraphs, probably enough. And then when you're ready, move on to part 4, which is stories in everyday life. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you then.